Hello, and welcome back to the PNN. My name is Parker Taft. Today is day 16 of our glorious 30-day challenge. Today, I'm going to be talking about the importance of history. You may be asking why. This is a self-development channel. Why are we going into history? Well, first off, history provides many important lessons that we can learn from, both in successes and failures, and help us guide us on our own self-development journeys and inform us on making decisions both on the personal, public, governmental, socioeconomic, and political levels. So it's very multifaceted. Second, as a history buff and a student of history, I've noticed a lot of people throwing around the term history and the facts and figures of it. Well, and I've found it quite discouraging that many people, first off, do not know their history or think they know it more thoroughly than they do, especially the misquoting and misrepresentation of many famous figures and many famous theories. Second, I find it very sad that many of the general public do not recognize the many common themes that you can find throughout history that are once again being repeated in the modern day. And I fear if people don't become aware of their history and the necessity both to preserve it and to learn from it in a non-biased or political way, we are only bound to make the same mistakes as we have in the past. And if there's one thing we can learn, that the past history will always repeat itself if you do not learn from its lessons. If you don't believe me, then you can look at the two world wars. So, we shall begin. So, what is history? For all those of you who fell asleep during your ninth grade fell asleep during your ninth grade history class, you probably are not too much aware beyond the basic facts. George Washington, first president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, 16th president, FDR. Besides a few famous names and figures and dates, you're not all that well informed about history and the greater themes of social, technological, and economic change that brought around some of the greatest advancements in human history. So, basically, history is the record and studying of the record of past events, particularly in the scope of human affairs. Yes, many people wouldn't be looking into the history of the cucumber, but the history of, say, New York or Pennsylvania, people would be interested in, or the history of Canada, So that's primarily what history is. So why is it important? Well, it's important for many reasons, as I have stated previously. It informs us about who we are, where we come from, and how we lived. Looking back on how Americans lived during the Revolutionary War and seeing how in the scant 200 and something years since then, we've gone from basically being a relatively backwater nation, you know, primarily agrarian and rural, to a heavily industrialized and urbanized country that is one of the most powerful nations on earth, having led the world to victory in 2 world wars and persevered through the Cold War. So it gives us a respect for the sacrifices and the hardships that our ancestors faced and how we have pretty good lives. Despite the COVID-19 outbreak that has everyone up in arms and freaking out, we live in a time of unprecedented abundance, both in material possession, economic and social security and freedom, equal rights, and also an unprecedented time of technological change, of the ability to communicate across the world instantaneously, something that has only been around for 30 years, which in the grand scales of time is a mere handful of seconds. So it's important for us to recognize how far we have come. It helps us to better understand ourselves and the world around us. It helps us to better appreciate the world around us. As I said, it gives us a better understanding of the hardship our ancestors face, even as much as going to the bathroom, having to trudge out in the middle of winter to go to the outhouse or, use the bathroom in a chamber pot. Not the most sanitary things, and I bet wasn't the most pleasant experience. But now you have indoor plumbing, so you don't have to brave the colds of winter or the heat of summer to go and do your basic bodily functions. And then you have the advances in medicine, vaccines, as controversial as they may be, antibiotics, antiviral medication. All of this is prolonged our lifespan and given us a better quality of life than ever before. It gives us tools to be good citizens. One of the two most critical documents in at least the history of the United States is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Declaration of Independence states why our country is here, and the Constitution states how we are to function as a nation. Without knowing and being cognizant of the ideas, both in and behind the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, a person may not fully understand how unique these documents are in the grand scheme of history. The closest thing you can get before, the late 19th, early 20th century would be the Magna Carta. The British Constitution, which many people see as similar to our own, is actually not written down. It's merely a symbol of practices, that have been ingrained in their legal and political structure over time. But if someone wanted to change it, they could. It was a snap of a finger, the passage of a law, a national emergency, and it could change. Whereas with our Constitution, there are in the Bill of Rights, which is a part of the Constitution, there are rights and freedoms enshrined in that Constitution. And unless there is a clear and present danger, those rights cannot be taken away or infringed upon, either by the state governments or by the federal government. So if a person isn't cognizant of the fact of how unique these documents are and the freedoms and rights they protect and preserve, a person whose rights and freedoms are trampled upon, a person wouldn't know what recourse they have, or if they even had those rights. Let's say there's a poor, low-income person, and someone, let's say their employer, wants to search their house. Well, they don't have to. Unreasonable search and seizure. Only the police can do it, and only with warrants. But if they didn't know that, they could, be bullied into allowing it to happen. Infringement. But with our Constitution and knowledge of the history behind it, they can challenge it, both in a court of law and before the general public. And lastly, it helps us make better decisions by learning from the mistakes and triumphs of the past. There's one important lesson that I want everyone to take away from this, if you only take away one thing, and that is history is unchangeable. History is history. It happened in the past, and no matter which way we write about it or cast it, it happened. We all have different opinions on the why, the where, the when, the how, but it happened. So when you look back at history and study it, do not look at it as if you are looking from the top of a glass down, using the modern day morals and strictures and beliefs of society for you to judge the past, because the past was different. They had different culture, different morals, different understanding of how society functioned and the basic norms of that society. Instead, look from the bottom up. Look from the previous generation and what the previous generation experienced, and then look forward to the generation that you're studying and see how it changed from one to the next. And you'll find that there was a great deal of progress, even though it may not fit in with our modern society or conform to what our modern society thinks. It is still an advancement, going from the oxen plow to an oxen iron plow to a steel horse-drawn plow was an advancement, was a leap ahead in technology, even though we don't see the difference. It's completely inefficient compared to a tractor-drawn plow or, some fancy schmancy technology. I'm not an agriculturalist, so I can't tell you. So, that's an important lesson. So why do we need to know it? Well, history has become trivialized in a niche, focusing on the inane and the obscure rather than the big picture as it originally did. History before was all about the big picture. The courses would be like History of North America or the geopolitics of Western Europe or something like that. And it would take in the social, the economic, the political, and the military, and combining it all into one big picture. History is not merely a timeline of this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. It is not simply a cause and effect. It is not simply a collection of dates, facts, and old dead white people. It is a web, interconnected. You know, everyone says the Great Depression and the Treaty of Versailles led to the Second World War, which is very much true. They were very big contributing factors. But there was also other factors, like the complacency of the Western powers to check the expansion of both Germany, Nazi Germany, and the Japanese Empire. The complacency and isolationism of the United States also played a huge factor in this. The interwar treaties, which limited the armed forces, specifically the naval forces, of the major powers, from the United States and Britain to France, Italy, Germany, Japan, and the powers that the main Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, halfway through disregarded the treaties, whereas the United States, England, and to a lesser extent France, stuck by the treaties in the hopes of preventing war, but were the ones who were actually caught off guard once the war began. So that is what history used to be. Now it's like trivialized and niche focused. Like an example is, let's see. Oh, here's a good one. The effect of sexual relations on the French Revolution. Well, I'm sure there was some effect on the French Revolution. It's a kind of inane and obscure topic that only a few people would be genuinely interested in, and has very little application in the wider scope unless it's tied in with a wider theme. The liberation of women, the expansion of their rights in Europe, etc., etc. But the topic in and of itself is completely obscure, inane, and really doesn't have any benefit to society in teaching it. History's become more of an entertainment, or something to be called upon to justify one's beliefs without actually knowing and understanding thoroughly the causes, the effects, and the web of interconnection and interrelation between historical events. Historical knowledge, as I said, is at an all-time low, while misrepresentation and misquoting of history and historical figures is at an all-time high. A great example, which most of you probably would know, is, the quotes on Instagram, and it's, everyone's like, don't trust it, because most people, you can put a quote from anyone, or you can even make up a quote, put it in front of a famous figure's picture, and people will believe that famous person said it. There was actually a study, I think Stanford did it, and they found that people actually believed more the social media posts with a wrong quote. So say they took a quote from Winston Churchill and attributed it to Abraham Lincoln. If they just wrote it out and then said, Abraham Lincoln at the bottom or Winston Churchill, they were less likely to be believed than if they put that in front of the person's picture, because for some reason in our minds visually we're like, oh, so he said that. And then you have many political and cultural figures who call upon history to justify their various arguments. I'm not saying those arguments are right or wrong, but I'm merely saying that some of them have been extremely biased and misguided in their interpretation and do not give a full explanation or context. And as a history buff, very few people would understand or, realize they were doing this. A great example is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who quoted that Washington, D.C. was the first to, ban slavery, and that it was their right to become a state, yada, 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 because they were so good at equality and stuff like that. Well, actually, interestingly, Washington, D.C. didn't ban the slave trade until the Compromise of 1850. This was long after Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, New York, the northern states had banned slavery, and most of what we would call the Northwest, or the Old Northwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, those areas had banned slavery when they were just territories. So it was a misstatement of fact, and it not only hurt her by making her look like she was, well, for lack of a better term, ignorant, but it also hurt her argument. So it just goes to show you how a lack of knowledge of history can come to bite you in the butt. Another thing is mistakes of the past are coming back to haunt us because not enough people understand history enough to identify the same common themes that are happening in the present day. A good example is with our current government. If you realize the tactic of divide and conquer, basically you create an us versus them narrative. You divide people along ethnic, socioeconomic, and political grounds, and then you rule over them. And that's happening in our current government. Our leadership is extremely divided, and they only perpetuate this narrative, while those who hold the true power, what would say the economic and political elite, the old school powers, still have a tremendous influence. And instead of them working for the best of the people, they're working for the best of the elites, which only leads to either one, a communist revolution like you have in Russia, which only creates a new elite to dominate, a sort of regression backwards to, say, a fascist or Nazi-ish dictatorship, as you saw in Italy or Germany, foreign adventurism, as you saw in Imperial Japan, or just a general breakdown in the political, social, and economic life, as you saw during the late French Revolution, or during the interwar period in Great Britain under the first Labour prime ministers. Not saying that a lot of good things didn't come out of the interwar periods of the French Revolution, but it just goes to show you that if you're not cognizant of the facts and the trends of history, we are bound to make the same mistake. So I advise everyone to go out and at least read a little up on their history and the uniqueness that is the American Constitution, both in its legal, political, and socioeconomic forms. We've made mistakes, but in the whole of human history, we're better than most. And I'll leave you with this quote from George Orwell. The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of history. Perhaps one did not want to be loved so much as to be understood. Who controls the past controls the future. So, Parker, you're telling us all this about history and its importance and whatnot. So, if we're interested, how do we study it? Well, the history curriculum, unless you have a really good teacher in public school, is completely bogus. They merely teach you rote memorization of facts with very little discussion and contextualization in connection with broader themes. That's actually generally discouraged because unless you're taking like an advanced AP course or have a really good teacher like I did, when I did U.S. history and AP European history, not so much for U.S. government, but my own interests covered me in that regard. But it's not effective, the curriculum. It basically teaches you memorization and leads to a bunch of kids being disinterested and forgetting the information almost as soon as they finish taking their final exam. So, a few pieces of advice. Use mind maps to help you visualize the connection between different historical events and people. There's a bunch of good ones online that you can look up. You can also make your own based on documentaries and books you read. I'm a big reader, as you all know, so I advise reading history books. They don't need to be textbooks. There's some really good ones out there by historians that are written as thoroughly as a textbook, but include more fun, upbeat, lighthearted, as well as serious topics, and is a lot easier for the layman to read than some of the textbooks or scholarly writings. Watch history documentaries and movies. YouTube is a very good place for that. There's a lot of them out there, from the Civil War to ancient Rome to the Peloponnesian Wars, everything you could possibly imagine, there's a documentary on there for it. There's also some good movie sites, and I think Netflix and Hulu also have some pretty good ones. But when you're doing this, be aware of possible bias, though, and look into sources. Like, most books will cite sources in the back, so just look through them, because some historians may inadvertently or advertently bias their works against particular viewpoints or particular positions. And some historical movies, a good one would be Gods and Generals. Another one would be the Genghis Khan with John Wayne in it. If you don't know that, look it up and you'll understand. They're not necessarily historically accurate and more likely portray a particular viewpoint that supports a particular ethnic, social, political, or economic belief, at the risk of being biased against particular viewpoints, or trying to memorialize or honor stuff that shouldn't necessarily be memorialized or honored, or make something look better than what it actually had been historically. Flashcards, they work very well for helping retain information on anything, although, again, that's more rote memorization, and I wouldn't advise it unless you're studying for like a test or something. Take notes on facts or analysis that you find interesting or important. Like I said, just keep a journal near you, and you can write down anything that you find interesting or important or that jumps out at you. And then determine the focus of your study. Well, I love history in all of its forms. If I could, I would sit down and read every history book ever written and visit every historical place that ever happened, from ancient China, the Indus River Valley in Egypt, all the way up to the Second World War, the Cold War, even the 90s. Yes, many people don't think the 90s is historical, but basically, anything that occurred past 20 years ago is considered a part of history. The 20-year time span is just supposed to be, modern, and allow historians and professors and educators to get a sort of perspective on it, because it's important to have a detached perspective and not be in the heat of the moment. That's why you have to analyze primary sources for possible bias, and that's why many historians use multiple primary sources to develop a well-rounded narrative. So, as always, I've included my sources and further reading. I will put the links in the description. I'm actually thinking about starting a new series talking about the lessons of history, specifically in the general idea of both general trends and in specific instances and events, what lessons we can learn that can drive and help our own personal development. As always, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Turn on that bell button for notifications. If you have any comments on topics that I should cover, or ways I can improve this channel, or just simply want to discuss how your 30-day challenge is going, simply leave them in the comment section below. As always, this is the P9 Broadcast, signing off.